Thank you very much, Martin. So now we begin the real work. And we have invited one person to start us up with the real work, one person who's really good at that, who always comes up with good ideas, good thoughts. It's Wiebe Bijker. Wiebe is professor at the University of Maastricht, where he's also chairing the technology and society activities. And by the way, you're also part of your advisory panel in Pachita. So yes, the floor is yours, Wiebe. We look forward to hear what you have to say. And we are 25 minutes ahead of the program, which means that you can write a lot of questions down on the paper in front of you to Wiebe. So that's very good. The floor is yours, Wiebe.
Thank you, Lars. I think I switched this on. Does it work so that you can hear me at the back? Thank you. The title of the presentation suggests that I'm going to review technology assessment, which I will, but I will also make an argument. I will make the argument that first, there was technology assessment about technology, innovation and science, just like that. Secondly, we figured out that the citizens, users, patients needed to be involved. So participation, the role of the public debates, they came into technology assessment. And my real argument today is that we now need to reinvent the state. So it's not just the state of play of technology assessment. I'm going to argue that the state should get into the play and we should reinvent democracy. The reviewing bit is always boring. On the other hand, you're clever enough to realize that a review is never innocent. So just spot where I may go wrong, at least go into directions that you don't like. I'm going to review that by focusing on 3 bits. I'm focusing on Europe, I'm focusing on TA, and I'm focusing on the role of science and technology in society. First, about Europe. What is the state of play in Europe? I personally take very seriously the formulation of the grand societal challenges. We can be cynical about politicians making statements, but I personally want to take them seriously here. They formulate big challenges for society. They then develop an agenda for all sides of sectors in society, including very prominently science and technology. So that is what I think is defining the current play in Europe. Focusing a little bit on our own work, I think there is an increased European-wide attention to technology assessment. There was STOA, the Office of Technology Assessment at the European Parliament. There are many national TA offices, and Lars already listed some of them in the top 8 of that slide that you were not supposed to read. And there are countries that are developing their own TA activities at the very moment. And of course, there is Pachita to help that all along. I am drawing, and I think this is the report that Lars actually referred to, I am drawing on one of the first deliverables of the Pachita project. Jurgen Gansenfles and Rini van Est have written that report that I, again, as a second speaker this afternoon, warmly recommend to your attention. And some of the things that I'm saying are drawn from that report. Let me now focus on TA and give you the state, my view of the state of play of TA, and that is where I may go wrong. This is where you may quite likely disagree with me. But I would say that TA starts in the 1970s, Office of Technology Assessment in the United States, and in its early days, it has a quite narrow focus. There was this naive belief in the American Congress that TA might provide a kind of early warning, and that if they just would ring the bell a bit earlier, then disaster could be prevented. Implicitly, and that's what we criticized over the past decades, implicitly was that idea of a linear development of technology, And if it starts there, you know it's coming here, you just want to be warned a bit earlier. Now, in the 1980s, that already broadened, that was criticized internally within the TA community. It became more strategic, less reactive to questions raised in politics, more strategic, and it became policy supporting in a broader sense than just answering questions of members of parliament. In the 1990s, in America, there was this acronym ELSA, Ethical, Legal, and Social Aspects. And in Europe, and one of the authors is here, Professor Arie Rip. I will draw on his work more in a minute. Constructive technology assessment. Well, this is a moment where someone at the age that I am need help in remembering the acronyms. I'm sure you're all much younger so that you don't need it, but particularly the fourth from the top is one that may be new to you. So it's the 3 E's. It's economic and environmental and ethical, legal and social aspects. And now that we're at this slide, let me help you. STOA is that Scientific and Technological Options Assessment Office of the European Parliament. IPTS is part of the larger play in Sevilla in Spain, Institute for Prospective Technology Studies, sort of a sister of TA studies. And finally, EPTA, which was already mentioned, the network of technology assessment offices in Europe. In the 2000s, as I mentioned, there is that quite explicit and deliberate going out into general citizenry, into general politics, the public, experiments with participation developed from technology. The Danes, Scandinavia was important in that. There were lots of experiments in the Netherlands, Rathenau Institute. And by now, I think most of the TA offices are one way or the other experimenting with new forms of participation. This is where I draw on the work, the recent work of Professor Arie Rip, and that is an article that probably is already online now in the journal Nanoethics, but will appear on paper during the next couple of months. Together with his successor as a director of the TA, the Technology Assessment flagship within the nanotechnology large consortium in the Netherlands, the two authors reflect on what TA within that Dutch nanotechnology activity has been. And I will return to that. That's one of the 2 points that I want to elaborate on in this presentation. And then secondly, that plea that I want to make about reinventing the state. This is my sort of review of technology assessment. Where did we come from? Where do we stand now? Focus a bit on science and technology in society. What is that science and technology in society? If we look at it from a perspective of technology assessment, how to conceptualize it. I think 2 sides of one coin. Technology is socially constructed. It's not just coming out of nature. It's not just coming out of laws of physics, chemistry, and economic efficiency. It's a social process. But the other side of the coin is that it is also shaping society. It is having a it's having a societal impact. And my favorite summary of those 2 sides of the coin are: we live in a technological culture. And when I say that, I use it as a kind of shortcut for arguing that we live in a society that by now, you cannot imagine anymore without the role of science and technology. There are 2 messages in that observation. One message on the left hand is to my colleagues in social sciences: don't think that you can understand society if you do not also try to understand the role of science and technology. But the mirror image message is to my colleagues in engineering: don't think that you can design a working technological system or that you can develop a scientific theory that is really making sense in our current societies if you don't also think about how it is socially embedded in that society. that is my review of where we stand in conceptualizing science and technology in society. Okay, that was the boring part. Now I'm going to argue for that new role of the state in TA. I think it's fair to say, and I realize that that is different in different countries, but this is a literal quote from a colleague in India, for example. I think that, and I'm prepared to defend this statement, that the state has been on retreat over the past, say, 2 or 3 decades. The neoliberal state gave over many of its responsibilities to to market forces, to industry, to whatever, depending on the vocabulary, depending on the ideology. The shifting out was labeled differently, but my claim is that the state has been on retreat over the past 2 or 3 decades, and I am going to argue that that should stop and we should reinvent the state. Those grand societal challenges are one good reason. If you formulate them like that, and if you're so convincing formulating them, then the next step inevitably is to take responsibility for addressing them. You can't just make a shopping list and let the shopping to someone else. But again, it is not an innocent question. What is then that state? I'm not going to argue that we should return to the kind of state that we had 30 years ago. So what kind of policy making do we now need in the current set of tensions, in the current set of societal challenges? What actually is politics? We can't forget Ulrich Beck arguing his sub-politics. There's a lot of work in political sciences. We have done a lot of work as a community of STS, Science, Technology and Society Studies, in TA, thinking about the politics related to science and technology. So let's take stock of that. Let's conceptualize politics in a way that fits that reinventing the state. And finally, that really asks something from the citizens. So what qualifications do citizens need? I used to be a secondary school teacher. I'm all in favor of better education, and I'm serious. But just asking for better education isn't enough. We should probably think about a new concept of citizens to match that reinvented state. Now, I'm not going to answer all those questions. I'm setting out an agenda for myself. Hopefully, I'm able to tempt some of you in, but it will inform part of my argument during the rest of this talk. This is a picture that will return several times. I will basically, so this is my tentative and first and kind of graphical answer to the question, what is the state? The state is a very heterogeneous, hybrid combination of different things. It's not one monolithical element, if it ever was. It definitely shouldn't be now anymore. There are elements of, there must be a red light here. There are elements that I now will label for this afternoon explicitly technology assessment. There is a distinct role for government to play. There is a role for parliament to play. And the fourth box is scientific advice. Scientific advice inevitably has to play a role. The starting point of TA was to give scientific advice to the American Congress. And that still was in a rather naive way. We write a beautiful report, and they were beautiful, those OTA reports. We dumped them on the table of the politicians, and then the ideas are so brilliant that they will take care of themselves. Now, by now, the practice of scientific advising is much more sophisticated. I'm not going to elaborate that, but I want that blue triangle diamond to be there to remind ourselves that an idea of scientific advice should be part of that new form of reinventing the state. One further footnote, much of the argument of technology assessment has been to maybe not question expertise, but put footnotes around expertise. There are different kinds of expertise. Users have expertise, citizens have expertise, not anymore only the scientists and the engineers. Now, in that world, where we have broadened the concept of expertise, then we also have to rethink what scientific advice can be. So that's why that blue diamond is there. So, as I said, I don't want to return to 30 years ago. I don't want to return to some monolithical old idea of the state. We somehow have to think now in terms of a science and technology that is essentially demand-driven. Again, a footnote. That doesn't mean that I am not very much in favor of more fundamental research, both in the sciences, in the social sciences, and the humanities. And I think there is a need for that to feed into the more demand-driven science and technology. But I think it's fair, in the context of a TA conference, to focus on the demand-driven side of science and technologies. Those demands as inspired by, for example, those societal challenges. I think by now there is a received recognition broadly that there needs to be an early engagement of users, public, citizens, patients, however we want to identify them in a particular case of science and technology. And there is that experience of constructive technology assessment that I'll say a little bit more about in a minute. In society, I think when we get in this program of reinventing democracy, reinventing the state, we need to think about new publics. Some of my colleagues draw on the work of Dewey, an American philosopher who tried to answer very big questions about democracy about 100 years ago for the United States. One of the ways that translates into our current TA agenda is to think of publics as being produced in the process of technology assessment, and different publics sometimes in parallel. And we need to develop a new politics. Those three, and originally in the report by Pachita, the report that I quoted by Gansenfles and Rini van Est, it's actually four, because they distinguish government, parliament, and then they talk about science and technology and society. Just because my slide was too small, I lumped government and parliament together, and I labeled them the state. So this is the other picture that I want to have return a few times, and I'll focus on the science and technology bit and on the society bit. The example that I will draw on is nanotechnology in the Netherlands, and that partly draws on the work that Arie Rip did and reported on in that article that I cited, and partly on work that I was involved in as a scientific advisor to the government through the Health Council and organizing a big public dialogue on nanotechnology. Why is nanotechnology such a nice strategic test site for new practices of TA? Because of this. There's no question that there are lots of promises in nanotechnology. They range from very clever new drug delivery systems that bring that chemotherapy only to that little tumor and leave the rest of your body relatively untouched, to new forms of very strong materials that you can use in hip replacements or in big constructions. And in your conference folder is one of the Volta issues that Lars already mentioned, produced from the Pachita project, and there is a large feature article on nanotechnology and food. I think it's safe to say that there is no sector in modern science and technology that will not be touched by nanotechnology. However, there are also indications of there are also indications of potential hazard, and these are serious. It's not technophobia. It's not people who are afraid of science and technology that scream and that create a hype. No, there is serious scientific evidence from laboratory experiments that there is something fishy going on. one way of labeling it, the narrow version of the problem, is nanotoxicity. And a sort of quick way of explaining it is that we all got into, in our secondary chemistry classes in school, this message that gold is inert. It doesn't react to other chemicals. That is why we wear it as jewelry. It doesn't react to your skin. If you make gold into such tiny particles that they get into the nano range, then it turns toxic. It turns highly toxic. There is evidence for it, but there's no complete understanding of that particular mechanism. There is over the past 5 years, there has been a huge effort to develop nanotoxicity research. So there is an increased knowledge, but it's still not completely known. Not as known as we understand how asbestos is toxic or how radioactive radiation can be harmful. So serious indication of harm, but no complete understanding. It implies that the current regulation isn't completely adequate. You probably all know that in Europe we have that REACH regulation for chemicals, but REACH basically deals with bulk chemicals. It deals with bulks of gold, let's put it like that. But as soon as you turn it, the gold, into very tiny particles, then the REACH regulation doesn't really fit. So what to do? Regulation isn't quite fit. The hazards, the hazards are there, but we don't want to stop the whole development because the promises are too high. Now, in that situation, how to move? There is a dilemma. This is a very old, very classical dilemma named after Collingridge, David Collingridge, a British researcher. And the dilemma is like this. Do we now have a dialogue on this problem of nanotechnology, now that we can still change the agenda, we can stop certain investments and developments and turn them into another direction? But we don't yet really know what we're talking about. We don't really know whether the promises will be fulfilled. We don't completely understand the hazards and the risks. So let's wait. But then, if we have the discussion later, then investments, and not just investments in money, but also investments in understanding, in universities, in teaching, in human resources, in expectations of people in society, have grown. And if that investment has grown so much, can you then still change the course of that big flywheel that has been picking up speed and direction? It basically is an insolvable dilemma, but you do have to choose. So we suggested the Dutch government to have a debate on nanotechnology. I'll give you a little bit more about the arguments that we used in a minute. And we left it to the Dutch government when to do this, what to choose in this dilemma. But they went for the upper option. They went for the option to do it quickly and somehow try to deal with that problem of having a debate and a dialogue about something that we really don't yet completely understand. This was this picture summarizes the core of an advice that the committee that I chaired gave to the Dutch government. The question that was asked of the Health Council was how to deal with these promises and these risks of nanotechnologies, how to balance them, what should we do with it? We said, well, let's distinguish different kinds of risks and allow us to give different answers to different risk situations rather than expecting one blanket answer for every situation. So the argument was, let's distinguish 3 kinds of risks: known risks, uncertain risks, and ambiguous risks. The known risks are quite risky. It actually can kill you. Asbestos is an example, radioactive radiation is an example. It is known risk because we basically understand the signs of it. Our argument, the committee's argument, has been, in such a case, just hand it over to the scientists. Don't bother with public debates. Don't bother with stakeholders. Scientists have been trained for it. They get a good salary. If they do their job bad, you just fire them. But let's not have a vote on 2 + 2 is 4. This is scientific business. They are trained. Everything is in place. Let's just give such a problem, such a risk issue to them. So if you need regulation for radioactive radiation, if you need regulation for asbestos, just hand it over to the scientist and ask scientific advice. That is different in the second category. That is the category of nanotoxicity. That is that category where the scientists themselves say, we don't completely know how things work here. So in such a situation, what should you do? Should we continue, should science continue developing that drug delivery system while not fully knowing the risk of having those nanoparticles in human bodies? Well, scientific evidence can't conclusively decide there. So that is where we advise to get stakeholders in. You need to get doctors in, you need to get patients in to then balance that decision and balance it with bringing in arguments that are not purely scientific. That say something like, well, considering the risk, but also considering the benefit of such a drug delivery system, we'd rather go for the risk, for taking the risk and further developing the drug delivery system. So you know you have to get into play what is at stake. So you really get in the stakeholders, people who have a stake in that particular debate, and try to get their advice too, and broaden the invitees at the table to also include stakeholders. In the third category, that's not enough. In the case of nanotoxicity, we basically agree that we don't want toxic materials in our world. I mean, the odd murderer excluded, but generally we don't want toxic materials around. The example here is that there isn't even an agreement in society in which direction to move. The nanotechnology example here is human enhancement. For example, one of my favorite examples is a nanochip planted in my brain to enhance my memory. My wife has a big family, lots of aunts and uncles, and I just can't remember their faces and names. So all those birthday parties and increasingly funerals are really a pain. Having a memory chip like that, I would really love. But you will immediately recognize there are lots of people in our current societies who would say, well, that is the last thing that we should do. That is tinkering with God's creation. That is something that we human beings shouldn't even aim for, not even try, not even think about. So here, there is a fundamental lack of agreement in which direction to move society. Then it's not enough to have stakeholders sitting next to the scientists at the table, because the stakes are unclear. You really have to define where to move society to. So there's no escape for also inviting, where is my button? Also inviting the citizens. Now, in this state of play, in this theater, I now want to make 2 points. The first is focusing particularly on the scientists, and I will use the work of Arie Rip as an example for that. And then secondly, I will talk about that dialogue that the Dutch government organized, and the arguments draw differently on this sort of map of the problem, that TA flagship within the nanotechnology consortium of the Netherlands, basically drawing all of nanotechnology research in universities and in private companies together in the Netherlands within that consortium to have technology assessment, in a way draws stakeholders and scientists across those different situations of risks, while the argument to have a societal dialogue is really, I mean, the rationale is that there is such a large part of ambiguity and uncertainty. Okay, let's first focus on the experiences in NanoNet, and this is again the article that I'm drawing on. CTA from the very beginning, I mean, it started in 2005. Constructive technology assessment is what basically defined the effort of TA within that NanoNet consortium. And quoting from the article, the way that the authors set up CTA in contrast to ELSA is that CTA much more from the inside, engaging with the engineers and the scientists, raises these questions about technology assessment, tries to involve them, rather than ELSA researchers, humanities people, social scientists, commenting on the ethical, legal, and social aspects from the outside. It's a bit of, I mean, I'm now drawing the distinction quite sharply, but it does show 2 points on the spectrum to approach the question. The article very nicely describes that an interesting dilemma. There was a lot of support from the management, the scientific director of NanoNet. The big guys, the big hotshots of nanotechnology realize, and that was also my experience in that governmental advisory committee, realize that they need a better link to broader society. They need TA. But it's different, and that is what the PhD students that I supervised experienced. It's different when you get down to the shop floor of the laboratories. Then that nanoscientist may not have time for you at that very moment, and may find it difficult to make time anyway. So there is a tension that there has been recognition of the role of TA from the top of that NanoNet consortium, and some success in getting it further down into the shop floor gremia, but that wasn't easy all the time. Nevertheless, that was the first 5-year program, NanoNet. Now they just started on the next 5-year program called Nano Next. In that second 5-year program, technology assessment has become even more prominent. Maybe prominent is not the right word, it has been more underpinning. It is flagship number 1, and it is, in a way, it's the gray fabric layer that underlays the whole matrix of the nanotechnology and nanoscience work that the scientists and the engineers are going to do. So again, there is a formal recognition of the success of the TA in the first 5 years, and we need to continue with that in the next 5 years. But still, how to do that? So, summarizing this bit of the story, and now with a few other words, in relation to the role of science and technology, the key words that the state needs there, I think, and I think they should be part of our reinventing that new state that is fit for this next agenda, are precaution, which was very explicitly an argument in our advice to the government to have this dialogue and to map the benefits and the possible risks of nanotechnology. Government, state should not be afraid to get into regulation. My second advisory committee that just finished 2 months ago was to answer what kind of safety measures are possible for workers with nanoparticles. Which was a difficult question because still nanotoxicity isn't completely understood, but both labor unions and the employers in the Netherlands and the state realized that some regulation is needed, even in that state of sort of half and partial knowledge. And in my argument of having a state that is taking a responsibility, they shouldn't leave it just to the labor unions and the employers, but really take responsibility and formulate regulation, which the Dutch state is, I think, now going to do. And finally, which is, and I'm not saying it because we are here as scientists who want to get more money from the government, but I think also that is a form of taking responsibility. There are, which is a very different example, which I can't elaborate, but we now know that some of the medical research that for political reasons, for societal reasons, we would highly value is just not getting enough attention because industry can't make enough of a profit. So those are situations where really a state should take responsibility and decide for funding. And there are lots of other elements in a science and technology agenda where I think the state should just face that that can only happen with public funding. The words in the second banner are CTA plus. Now the plus refers to also including thinking about responsible innovation, and a term that I slightly adapted from the way that Arie Rip presented it in the article, something like reflexive design. Try to get into the design, into the practices of innovation, a form of reflection already by the scientists and the engineers, not just on their own, but by making them talk to the ethicists, historians, sociologists, anthropologists, the people that can do the TA within that second banner. Okay, now I'll turn to the third banner, the last banner, and I will report to you about that societal dialogue in the Netherlands. It was a 2-year process. We could spend 4 million euros, which was quite serious. It was before the economic crisis really struck. And I consider it really an experiment on democracy and an experiment on how to handle science and technology in our democracies. Another way of formulating it is that I've used before is I think we have to reconsider our constitutions. All of our countries, also a country that I work a lot with in India, which is only 60 years independent, even India has basically a 19th century constitutions. We all are children of Montesquieu, and we can't blame good old Montesquieu for not having thought about that prominent role that science and technology now play in society. So we really have to reinvent democracy, but taking in and then taking into account the role that science and technology play. I was vice chair of the committee that spent that 4 million, organizing that societal dialogue, and these are some of the choices that we made in designing it, and I will briefly run through them. First of all, we very deliberately put ourselves as a committee and not just ourselves, the government realized that we needed to be at a distance from government. We've had 2 more large societal debates in the Netherlands, one on nuclear power and one on genetically modified food, and particularly the last one by most people is considered a kind of a disaster, and the diagnosis was that it became a disaster when people didn't trust the independence of that dialogue process, and that people just suspected that government had already made up its mind and was only using the dialogue to kind of push through, to have it as a lubricant and push through that already made decision through society. So we were put at a distance from government. I mean, even to the detailed consequence that I didn't send my train tickets to the ministry, but to the university that was managing that whole process. Now, of course, nothing is innocent. There is a price to pay, and it's with a question mark because I'm still making up my mind. But evidently, putting a committee like that at a distance from government weakens the political mandate. I think that in the end, I still have balanced feelings. We offered the final results to a member of parliament. Was he then member of parliament or state? Well, or as Secretary of State, I can't remember. I mean, he moved to Secretary of State. And he was very warmly welcoming it, but then to trace that development into the nitty-gritty details of regulation is a different job. I think that there was quite some resonance of the dialogue more broadly in Dutch society, including in politics, but it's difficult to quantify that and to make that into a solid statement. Second choice, we deliberately went for a very broad spectrum of participants, from secondary school children to scientists, from labor unions to fundamentalist Christian and fundamentalist Islam church groups. The price is that maybe we, because of that, were less effective than when we had targeted exclusively on some key actors, members of parliament, policymakers, some scientists, some industry, carefully selected for a prime role in nanotechnology. We went all over the place. Our argument, of course, was that we needed to draw those citizens in, so there were good arguments for the choice, but there's always a price. We externalized the activities. We didn't spend that 4 million ourselves. There were 2 calls for proposals. Everyone in the Netherlands was invited to come up with a proposal to do a bit of that dialogue. And we actually got, from that broad range of actors that I just mentioned, we got proposals, and there were some 30 proposals awarded. From those fundamentalist Christians, but also a TV series, theater plays, a teaching material for secondary school, an exhibition that went to different supermarkets, outside the supermarket in a bus, showing from a kind of artist's perspective what kind of products might be in the making when you use nanotechnology. A very broad range of people and a broad range of media and means. And again, one could ask whether that led to a lack of focus, or we were hoping that we were casting the net so wide that we would draw in more people than otherwise by using the standard ways of dialoguing would have worked. And finally, to cope with the Collingridge dilemma, we said, let's distinguish these 3 phases. First, we need to give information. If we don't give information, or sorry, I have to correct myself. Not we need to give information, but information needs to be given, because also that we outsourced. Information needs to be given and shared. Then there needs to be an awareness that actually there is an issue, there are promises, there are risks, so somehow we have to think about it. And then you can have that dialogue. We asked people to specify what they would want to focus on, either of the 3 or combinations of the 3 or all 3. And we slightly managed that through time in that period of 2 years. More of the dialogue projects were coming at the end, and most of the information projects were coming at the beginning. I'm quite happy with what happened from a TA perspective. This is the result. We did a representative quantitative survey, not only amongst the participants of the dialogue, but broadly in Dutch society. Just hired some survey bureau to do that. And this is the result. 3 steps. First, there was a significant increase in understanding of nanotechnology. A small but significant increase. And still, about 40% of the Dutch population has no clue. But roughly 60% knows what nanotechnology is, and that was some 2% higher than when the dialogue started, a significant increase. And part of that understanding of nanotechnology are the benefits, because that is how it is typically introduced. So what does it get you? What's good about it? Secondly, there was also a statistically significant increase in recognizing that it is a risky business. So after the dialogue, more people knew better how risky nanotechnology is than they knew before the dialogue. Now, what was the effect of that? Still, there was an increased support for nanotechnology. So my conclusion, which I think is a big hooray for TA more generally, my conclusion is that the Dutch citizens are not so much afraid of science and technology. No, they are afraid of a government and an industry and science that doesn't honestly tell them about the risks. And we have literal quotes from different bits of the dialogue where people say, yeah, I now understand what it may get us. So you, scientist, you go on as long as you spend as much time on studying the risks as you do on developing that new material. So there is that recognition that it's not a simple matter. We may run risks, but as long as those scientists, whom we now have been in dialogue with and who were so open about their lack of certain knowledge in particular point, as long as they promise to continue doing research, then let's run that risk. Then we think we should do that. That was an increased agreement among the Dutch citizenry. So, to sum this up, those are the items of technology assessment that I want to focus on. Those are the moments where the government took decisions, and there's a second one at the end. There were moments where there was explicit scientific advice solicited by the government. Let's focus on the TA activities. The very first TA activity was done by the Rathenau Institute before the vast majority of the Dutch citizens, also politicians, and I would even say many of the scientists had even heard of nanotechnology. The Rathenau Institute put it on the agenda. They broadly defined that there was a problem, but there was also a potential benefit, and that it was something that needed to be thought about. So it's an example of proactive TA, very explicitly asking the question, what kind of society do we want, Dutch fellow citizens? And then, having made up our mind, we have to address nano. At the very end, there was this public debate. Normally, the Rathenau Institute could have done that. This was such a big thing that it was outsourced by the government to a separate committee, but in principle, it is something that a TA office could have done, and that is the big dialogue that I just reported about. In the middle, there was an activity again by the Rathenau Institute, which is not really part of that third yellow banner, but much more part of the second yellow banner, the interaction with the scientists and the engineers, where they got in stakeholders, members of parliament, labor union, employers, and scientists to discuss this particular scientific advice, the advice that I showed you in that one picture with the 3 categories of risks, and help them and get their input in translating that into next steps. One other way of talking about the first and the last form of technology assessment is, and I'm implicitly quoting Indian colleagues here, is that these are new imaginations of our society. It's trying to develop a new imaginary of what our society plus its science and technology could be, and then as a basis of and make a basis of that for policy making and scientific research. Government was crucial because they, using that Rathenau agenda setting proactive report, said, okay, we want scientific advice. We understand that really there is something at stake, but we have no clue how to figure out that map of nanotechnology. So let's get scientific advice, and that was the work of the Health Council then. That work of the Health Council specifically reviewed what is now called hard impact. So it particularly was about, not exclusively, but typically about toxicity and that kind of problems. Soft impacts, the impacts of science and technology on the development of new value systems, new priorities in society, should, I think, as much be part of technology assessment activities, but it typically will not be part of the scientific advice, but much more part of the more broadly aimed TA activities. To conclude, I think that technology assessment works at those three levels, those three yellow banners. State level, science and technology itself, and at society. And I think that my plea, the one-line summary of my talk this afternoon is that I hope that in the near future we won't think about TA as being exclusively in one of those three realms. It needs a foot in each of those three. And there needs to be interaction between the three. As Wiebe described in his NanoNet program, they explicitly realized that they did not need to do certain things because the Rathenau Institute was there. So there is an explicit recognition for what the other activities in the other two banners are. And then what does TA do? I think it fundamentally gives scientific evidence to inform politics. I don't shy away from that scientific evidence. I mean, there's a lot of plea for evidence-based politics nowadays, and I think that TA is the prime candidate to offer that kind of evidence base for politics. It secondly engages with science, it engages with the engineers and the scientists and not criticizes them from the outside. Of course, this raises the classical problem of engagement and distance. I mean, TA needs to be critical. It not only needs to engage, it also needs to be critical, that its very function. But not from the outside, by building relations within science and technology. And finally, and that was my big plea, it's all part of a larger agenda of innovating our democracy. Thank you very much.
There was. So it's not about if we should have CTA, if we should have participatory TA, or if we should have scientific evidence. It's about finding the right mix of them in the right situation. Any questions, comments, additions, whatever you want to do? Yes? Yeah.
Asking about, it's a rather bold statement about technology assessment being used to reinvent the state, where the system dialogues seem to imply that it's sort of enhancing the function of the state, making it more responsive, more innovative, and so on. So I just wanted to push a little bit on that. Is it really a reinvention or just a strong enabling function for the parliament, the government, and so on? Thank you.
Let me just plead guilty. This is rhetorics. I like that phrase, reinventing the state. But it's not innocent rhetorics. I think I will continue using it because I do want to flag that we need to be bold and that just a little bit optimizing current functions of the state may not be enough. No, I'm serious. That is different from saying that I have an answer. But I'm serious in saying that I think we should be bold and we should be really be experimenting with democracy. I mean, the sort of experience that I reported to you now about this dialogue is something that, for example, in India, they are very keenly interested in, and they are wrestling, as we know from newspapers, they're wrestling with their own problems of democracy. Yet they are extremely proud of their democracy, having the biggest population in the world, and now for 60 years with its up and downs, but still a well-functioning democracy. They think that they really need a radical rethinking of how that democracy functions, and they look at experiences like this to learn from that. So it's a bit of rhetoric, but then it's conscious rhetoric, and I think we should be bold. And it's more flagging that than that I have any sort of radical answer of a new blueprint of that new state. And to be well, and last footnote, if I had not been given this title, I probably would have been talking about democracy rather than the state of play, etc. So it was also a bit of play with words.
Gentleman up there, you can present yourself, please.
Philip Vergracht from Thales Institute in Boston and Clark University in the US. Thank you, Wiebe, for a very interesting talk. I have a somewhat smaller and a somewhat larger question. The somewhat smaller is that I've done a little bit of research in nanotech, and thanks to Ari who helped me along with that. I try to get into the research itself. What is actually being done in business, and what can we actually know about what's going on in the pipeline of innovation? And the conclusion of that research is, obviously, it's very difficult, but what we really need in TA is going upstream into the research and talk about intellectual property rights and reforming of that. And I didn't hear you say that word, intellectual property rights, but I would like you to reflect on that. The big question is, I moved on somewhat towards sustainable consumption, and in sustainable consumption there is a whole debate on growth and degrowth. And so there's a whole degrowth movement that basically think for a very good reason that science and technology is one of the main drivers of growth in society. And if we think about sustainability, we need to think of degrowth at least in material throughput and in energy, which also means that we need to rethink economics as a science. Now, I didn't hear you talk at all about economics in the traditional sense, but I think that we really need to engage in these type of debates, including trying to reform neoclassical economics into more ecological economics. So a small and a big question. Sorry for that.
Yeah. Now, on both accounts, I couldn't agree more with you, Philip. The case of IPR, there's just no good reason not to mention it. And I think but maybe the only reason is a fairly weak reason that as soon as I get into that, it would further explode my talk. But we can't discuss these things if we don't also pay attention to property rights. And I would even, that's a little bit of exploding that I'm already doing now, I would then also want to have broader questions of justice on the agenda. So not only the narrow sort of classic capitalist property discussion, but where it originally came from. So how can we have justice? How can science and technology help us move to a more just society, but also make sure that industry has enough money to actually do its research, which is part of the background of patents. And so I think it is absolutely part of the broader TA agenda, and I plead guilty for not mentioning it, but I'm pretty happy that you did. Basically, the same applies to economics. I think this is, and I even find it more difficult to address that. I mean, but that's more personally. I mean, I don't think there is any principal problem, but it's more my lack of background there. Then I think that the way that the Rathenau Institute some 15 years ago put nanotechnology on the agenda, asking a big question, what kind of society do we want? I think that the issues that you list, long-term sustainability, I would think an inevitable redistribution of wealth over the world, that raises similar questions. Then I would say there's no way that we can hope to address those questions. Also the turning down of energy consumption without very sophisticated, high quality science and technology. That makes it a TA question. Again, I plead guilty. I couldn't do everything, but I think you're right. The second question is bigger. So we really need creative thinking to put that on the map in a way that doesn't sort of push scientists away, but draws them in to rethink those broader wealth questions. Make it into a sort of captivating, sweet technology, the way that Oppenheimer talked about another technology being sweet.
And then we have David Cope. David?
Yes, thanks, Wiebe, for a wonderful tour d'horizon. I wasn't quite clear, and this may perhaps be a particular Anglo-Saxon perspective, in which case, please forgive me. But I'm not sure I'd agree with you where you're grouping Parliament as a facet or element of the state. Now, if you grouped it as an element of the nation, I don't think anybody could argue against that, but I would actually argue rather there's a dialectic here, and that Parliament has a role as a counterbalance to the state. And certainly if you look at the creation of both the OTA and the office at the UK Parliament, it was a specific request from parliamentarians to be assisted in order to be able better to call the government and the state into account. And the sense that they were members of an institution of a representative democracy that had the interest of the nation and the people of the nation, but not necessarily the interests of the government, and certainly not the interests of individual other institutions at heart. So I'd like you, you've got a little nick in your diagram, I saw you were separating state and parliament. I want to push that nick with you. The other thing, I don't know, this last thing here, TAs should be innovating democracy. That's a big call. I think if we do approach it, we've got to approach it with enormous modesty. We've got to recognize these big issues about representative versus delegatory democracies and new institutions in democracy. We've got to represent that many others, we've got to recognize, sorry, that many others besides the TA community will have an interest in the future direction of democracy, which may not necessarily be completely congruent with what you're saying there. So I'd like to explore that more in a fairly modest way, but I'd be interested to hear your views on the state versus parliament.
Wiebe, can I just, because I think the first one is answered quite quickly, if I know you well, but the second one, I actually had a question for you, which is very much close to that. Because how far would you go in this innovating the democracy? And my statement is maybe the opposite of David's, not very surprisingly on this. We have been working with the Danish regions, and together with them, we began to talk about new political working modes, which basically something which I think goes a little step further than what you talk about. Because what we began to formulate was the idea that policy is made with politicians, with experts, with stakeholders, with citizens, so in dialogue. But the representative democracy goes in and takes the responsibility for taking the decision. So a much more pluralistic and open policy formation process. But then the representative democracy takes its own role at some point. Is that too far out on the edge of what you're talking about, or what's that?
No, I think, and I will return to the small needle in the upper yellow banner. I think this is included in what I mean here, and I think it doesn't contradict your plea for caution. And I completely subscribe that plea for caution. There are, in other occasions, I've been arguing that we should, like we are more than happy to criticize technocracy. In the old days, we should also be wary of STS-socracy. So I don't want to put myself into the position that as if I could, or that the community of us could innovate democracy or could dictate what. No, I'm more arguing. Let's realize that the work that we do, that the work that is done in the TA community, has relevance for fundamentally rethinking our democracy. So it's more casting or realizing that there is that broader agenda. But then with all the modesty that you were pleading for, but that would also include that kind of activities. Because I think that, I think that, let's face it, our representative democracies have already been reinvented. I mean, they don't work the way they were designed 100 years ago already. I mean, that is one of the reasons why there are all these experiments with public debates and with stakeholder conferences. I mean, everyone knows that the representative democracy doesn't function as it was in the early days written down. My plea here is to more explicitly reflect on those experiments, like the ones that you do in Denmark, and try to draw. I mean, then be bold and try to get into broader discussions about what kind of democracy do we want in our country. But then, in all the modesty of just setting an agenda, giving some arguments, and then see what happens. I mean, if you take dialogue as seriously as I do, then you must also be prepared not to get it perfectly your way.
Okay. Now I have...
And the small needle?
Yeah.
Yes, you're right. That's partly a Dutch continental prejudice. It's partly the slide being too small. And it's also that I think that we really need to think also the relation between parliament and government. And that I lump together in that state. But everything that you said I agree with, yeah.
Okay, then I have two, Leo Hennen first, and then the gentleman in the green jacket up there. And then Lenka has some organizational details for us for the sessions afterwards. We won't miss them, won't we? So please be quick. We take both questions first, and then we round it up. Yeah.
Yes, Wiebe. You see, we do not let you escape with rhetorics here. That's for sure. My question goes in the same direction as the questions before. I would like to know how far you would at least think about what it means to reinvent democracy. Then if I look at these three levels where TA has a role to play, then you could easily identify at each of these levels a constitutional problem. At a certain point in your talk, you said even we have to go beyond the Montesquieu system, which would mean we have to go for a new constitution. This is just a kind of a provocative question, but the first level, evidence to inform politics, you could ask about the relation from discourse and power here, and we always can ask, and we see it in our practice, that we give advice to politics, we give evidence, but they don't care, and they do not have to care, really. On the second level, engagement with science. Science and technology development is mainly a private enterprise, and there is a private right to do that. And then nobody is obliged to open the laboratory to invite others to say, just have a look what we are doing here. At least they won't do in a competitive sector to do that. This is a constitutional problem. And on the last level, we are discussing for years, many years now, about what are we doing in participatory exercises. Is it perhaps an idle business because people can talk about what they want, but nobody is obliged to listen, and there is no institutional construction to take care that people have to listen. Would you go that far in constitutional reforms?
I would want to go that... Sorry, oh yeah, you're right. I'll take them together, yeah.
Thank you. Herbert van Kura from Austria. Actually, it's probably something that goes even beyond that question. I was quite shocked when I heard you say state. And then came up with the example of nanotechnology, where at least some of the risks clearly extend beyond national state borders. So if we then talk about justice, about economics, about differential gains, about stakeholder involvement, reinventing democracy, where would you draw your, shall we say, system boundaries of engagement?
Yeah. So the letter is easiest to answer, and again, I apologize for not being more clear, but I'm not talking about national states only. I mean, the whole argument applies to the European Commission, and in whatever way we have set up the governance of Europe. And we can't, I've been part of a nanotechnology project with India and Africa. So there's no way of of taking this argument seriously and sticking to national. If that is what you mean, then we completely agree. It doesn't make it easier, but at least we agree. Yes, I do want to take it into all those constitutional realms, and I think we have evidence that it is not impossible. That is why I spent so much time on this dialogue, where there was quite some skepticism in the beginning, but and from all parties. But in the end, there were explicit statements of participants. I was going to say housewives, but I'll be clobbered over my head if I say that. But I mean, non-scientists who were quite impressed by the way that the scientists and engineers participated. I was part of a big project with secondary school children, where they had the teachers had combined their chemistry, physics, and I think history classes for 3 months to work on a project, and the presentations were just brilliant. I mean, they really got into the nitty-gritty details of a little bit of nanotechnology, then developed some value analysis and came up with a personal statement. And I think that generally, well, as I said, it's difficult to trace how much mandate in the end the dialogue in the end appeared to have. But I definitely, I mean, this experience definitely would support me in arguing for giving more constitutional power to such dialogues, to somehow building it into the larger frame of that newly reinvented democracy that we are thinking about. Now, I think the experience but Ari should talk on that. The experience with NanoNet and NanoNext is that if the circumstances are designed well, then scientists more or less happily are willing to open up and to address these broader issues. I mean, Philip is right, and as I mentioned, some of the research that Ari reported on also shows that it's sometimes difficult to get into the laboratory. But there are also examples of particularly nanoscientists, recognizing that if they don't do a better job than the GM people 15 years ago, whole nanotechnology may be in serious trouble. I mean, I was bad enough to play that card, to remind some of those scientists, I mean, this is already 10 years ago, of the trouble that Europe got itself into in discussing biotechnology and genetic modification. And sure, they wanted to talk about it from their nanotechnology agenda. So I think that also there could be some constitutional power. We could regulate that in certain cases, certain risks, certain styles of science and technology, there is a prescribed engagement with TA type of activity. Like in the United States, ELSA is part of legislation. So I think that could be given constitutional power.
Wiebe, we have some.
Yeah, and the difficult guys are the parliamentarians and government. But if anyone should listen to laws, then it's them. So let's also define a law that makes them listen to us. But I should stop now.
Thank you very much, Wiebe. I think it's very important that you brought us up in the helicopter before we start 3 days of working with concrete cases, lots of presentations. I think it gives a very interesting reference point to think of the consequence of opening up discussion about a very important thing in a technological culture. So very much thanks for this. Thanks for bringing us up in the helicopter. And now down to earth again, because Lenka will then now give us some organizational details, I guess it's about the sessions. And you will have to listen to that before you get coffee.
Thanks, Lars. So thanks, Wiebe, for this very first keynote speech and for introducing the conference as such by this. And now let's work a bit after the coffee break. So I have some organizational details for you, so just to know a little bit where to go and what to do now. So this building is a little bit of a labyrinth. So then you have the rooms of the individual sessions here on the board, as well as on the monitor, which is in the foyer. So there you will always find your room of your particular session. This is the bowling hall, the main one. So here, the people which are in the TA and governance session will stay. And then after the coffee break, the people which will stay for the evidence-based policymaking session. The other ones which are in the other sessions have to follow the instructions from the girls which are on the registration desk, because I think that the first day you will not be able to find it yourself. So maybe just you know, ask in the foyer, ask at the registration desk, and they will tell you where exactly to go. There is also, behind the registration desk, there's also a board, and maybe you don't remember in which session actually you are now, which happens. So then you have a board there, and there is a list of people in the particular sessions registered. So if you want to make yourself aware again in which session you are, then you go there on the board and you see your name in the particular session. And then one more note. This conference is Twitter friendly, which means you can tweet, and you can tweet on a hashtag which is called Pasita13. And you need a Wi-Fi open access for this. And there is a Wi-Fi open access which is NTK-Pasita, and the password is Pasita 2013. And you probably don't remember this, so that's why you have the small program just behind your badge. There is a QR code for your smartphones, and also there are all sessions listed there, so you know where to go and what to do. So have a nice coffee break, and let's have a good start to the sessions.
But let's start to thank Wiebe for his magnificent presentation.
A practical question. I see there is a difference in the program, in the booklet, and what we found here in the map. So my question is, what is the most reliable source for? Well, okay. If you don't know, then
the big one is the actual one.
Okay, the big one.
The updated one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Coffee break, half an hour, nearly. Please be in the rooms, in the session rooms, 1:45.